This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion and everything in between.
Welcome to the UnShaw Podcast, broadcasting today from the rainy and contemplative streets of Liverpool. I'm your host, Robert Shaw, and today we're thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. James McGrath. Dr. McGrath holds the prestigious Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University in the US. His academic journey is marked by excellence with credentials from esteemed institutions including the University of Cambridge, where he earned a diploma in religious studies, and Durham University, where he obtained his PhD. A prolific author, Dr. McGrath has contributed significantly to the scholarly landscape with works such as The Only True God, The Burial of Jesus, and Theology and Science Fiction. Dr. McGrath's blog serves as a digital repository of knowledge where he explores a myriad of subjects including religion, the Bible, science fiction, evolution, and more. Join us this serene Sunday as we embark on a journey of exploration and enlightenment with Dr. James F. McGrath. Welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure. Looking forward to our conversation.
When I was doing my homework on you, I obviously went to the three places where people get information from these days, and that's ChatGPT, Wikipedia and YouTube. And I was rather expecting, when I logged onto a YouTube interview with you to have a cut-glass British accent, because having looked at your education, there's the University of London, University of Cambridge, University of Durham. What prompted you to get your university education in the UK?
In my teens, as I was getting towards the end of high school, thinking about university, also came to a personal faith that had me interested in the possibility of doing something related to that. And at the very least, figuring out what I might do that might express that. And one of the first things I did as I was thinking about this was to spend some time doing some volunteer work on some children's camps in the Republic of Ireland. And when I was there, most of the people who were doing those were from various places around the UK. There were some from the Republic of Ireland as well, but mostly from England, from Scotland, some from Northern Ireland. And they were also from a range of denominations and Christian backgrounds. And between the cultural difference and the diversity of Christian background, they had a whole range of views on things. And they considered things important that I had not even heard of. And there were things that I considered important that they couldn't figure out why anyone would care about those things and pay that much attention to them. And so I realized very quickly that Christianity and theology are much more diverse than I had thus far encountered. And so was eager to find some place where I could study that was not denominationally affiliated, and a lot of theological schools and places like that in the United States are. And also one where I would have more chance of interacting with people from another part of the world as well, and who spoke something not entirely unlike my native language, or I spoke something not entirely unlike English. Maybe this is a better way to put it. And so I applied, and the rest, as they say, is history, and loved studying in the UK and have gotten back when I've been able to. In fact, spent a bit of my recent sabbatical when I've been working on John the Baptist in the UK, which was wonderful.
You mentioned that you wanted to get this exposure to different types of Christianity. Did you have an upbringing in one particular denomination?
Yes, so my upbringing was actually in the Roman Catholic Church. The McGrath name reflects Irish ancestry on my father's side. My mother was a mixture of Eastern European Roman Catholic on her father's side and Jewish on her mother's side. This is the sort of thing that one encounters not infrequently in New York City, where people from all over the world intersect. And so that's what my upbringing was. But I was going through something of a seeker phase, trying to figure out what I believed, feeling that my religious tradition that I'd inherited had not had a life-changing impact on me personally, and was looking for something more real. And so was pondering things, and eventually found my way to an encounter with religious music, contemporary Christian music, and people singing about their own faith that was done in a way that reflected that they had some sort of real experience, at least in some instances. And so I accepted an invitation to a friend's church, which was actually a Pentecostal church. There was a concert there, and had a born-again experience in that context. And so that marked a turning point from a nominal Catholic background to very, very interested in Christianity and in learning more about the Bible and things like that.
And you remained within the Pentecostal tradition. In fact, are you still there now?
No, I'm not. Not at all. So I meandered a bit, I guess you could say. But perhaps the most decisive influence is that I married a woman from Romania, who I met in the UK when we were both students, who was a Baptist, and so have settled in the Baptist tradition.
And following university, you've had this glowing academic career, and you're currently holder of the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University.
That's correct.
I put out a message to the listeners of the podcast asking them if there were any questions that they would like me to put to you. And I guess this question is a good place to start. Now, you obviously are more knowledgeable than myself and no doubt all of our listeners about this question. But one of my followers said this in response to, what would you like me to ask, James? And this is from @Hicksville420 on X or Twitter. And he says, geez, I wouldn't know where to begin. According to many, there is zero historical or archaeological evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed on planet Earth. What is his evidence? Now, I looked at your Wikipedia page and noticed that you are a critic of the Christ myth theory, which, for the benefit of listeners who have not heard of that, that's the theory that Jesus Christ did not exist as a human being. What's your arguments that there was a historical Jesus? What arguments would you use to convince someone of the reality of the historical Jesus?
Yes, that's a good question, and one that I've thought a lot about. And on the question of archaeology, right, more specifically, since your questioner raised that, it's not realistic to expect to find archaeological evidence of most ancient people. The people who left behind archaeological evidence, inscriptions, they minted coins, things like that, were the wealthy upper echelon of society. And so since there's no claim that Jesus was that sort of individual, expecting to find archaeological evidence is unrealistic, even for those who were those sorts of people. Whether something has survived down to the present day can be hit or miss. And so it's an important axiom that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If we had reason to expect something and found no evidence of it, then sometimes that does indicate something, right? If somebody says that there was an empire in a particular part of the world, and you dig and you get to the appropriate time period, you dig a bit further just to make sure, and there's no sign of anything, then you'd say there probably wasn't, and this is probably mythological and things like that.
Yeah.
Looking for an individual, though, then the chances that you're going to find something specifically connected with them that has some markings on it that would indicate its connection with them is exceedingly small.
How about historical evidence? Now, I've spoken to a number of people who have said, yeah, if there was this guy wandering around Jerusalem or wherever, and he was walking on water and bringing dead people back to life, there would be more evidence outside of the Bible about this person. How would you respond to that?
Yes, I think that's the perfect way of asking the question to represent the misunderstanding of what historians are talking about on the part of many who subscribe to the Christ myth, who deny that there was a historical Jesus. When we're talking about the historical Jesus, we're not talking about a person who walked on water. The historian will most likely assume that those things are all legendary, but at the very least, we'll set them aside and say, we don't have a way of confirming these using historical methods. Such things are inherently improbable. Historical analysis evaluates probability and will never be able to say that the inherently improbable probably happened a couple of thousand years ago.
Well,
it will always be more likely that stories were invented than that somebody walked on water. That somebody experienced spontaneous recovery from psychosomatic illness and attributed it to divine action, then that there was a divine action, right? There are no historical methods that can prove divine action at work. And so when we're talking about the historical Jesus, we're talking about an individual who traveled around, who was known as a healer, probably an exorcist, because there were people then as there are now. And presumably there were people who experienced recovery and attributed it to him, and there's nothing historically implausible about that. And a figure about whom his followers, and perhaps he himself, held some sort of what we might call messianic view.
So if we put miracles aside then, would there not be some form of reference to some preacher who had a big following and was crucified and so on? Even if we kind of take the miracles out of everything, wouldn't there be some mention of Jesus in contemporary historical records?
There certainly could be, and I would say that there are. We have references to not just Jesus, but also John the Baptist, to a series of various people who alluded to a sign that God's deliverance was at hand, and who were executed and their followers dispersed. And we have Josephus' account of these figures. If we didn't have Josephus, certainly some of them we wouldn't know about. There is appropriate skepticism of what conservative Christians have claimed about biblical texts. What is often forgotten is that those texts existed before they were brought together and treated as scripture. And so in the case of Paul's letters, whatever you think of his religious views, he wrote letters to people who were part of a movement that looked to this individual as their central focus, despite the fact that he had been executed. And so you have the paradox of a crucified Messiah executed. This is inherently paradoxical, and the best historical explanation, the one that's most probable, is not that somebody just thought they'd come up with this and tried to persuade people to believe it, but that there was a group that thought this individual, Jesus, was the anointed one. And despite his being crucified, they managed to find a way to persist in that belief. And so Paul's letters, the fact that he mentions having met the brother of Jesus, things like that, provide evidence as well. The fact that these letters were later accorded the status of sacred scripture doesn't affect the ability of historians to use them.
Okay, so what you seem to be saying is that Paul's letters and the fact that he talks so enthusiastically about this person, and the letters are quite early, aren't they? In fact, aren't they the earliest forms of New Testament scripture that we have?
Yes, that certainly seems to be the case. Yeah.
And I guess you're invoking also the criterion of embarrassment, which for the benefit of listeners is basically saying that, if you're going to invent a Messiah figure, if you're going to invent the notion of God on earth, you're going to come up with something a bit more convincing than someone who was crucified. Is that something that you would subscribe to as well? That seems to be what you're saying.
Yes, and this is just a general principle of historical reasoning. If you find the supporters of, let's say, some particular political candidate basically doing damage control in relation to their supposedly having lost an election and maintaining that nonetheless they were the true and rightful prime minister, president, whatever else it might be, you would deduce from that, if you were a historian looking back, that it seemed to other people that this person had lost the election. They wouldn't be framing it that way and trying to claim that this person is the successful candidate and yet mentioning loss of election, unless there were something that actually happened that compelled them to say this thing that seemed to undermine their claim. I think it's a general principle of reasoning that one can utilize.
You've mentioned Josephus, and as far as I'm aware, Josephus's writings about Jesus come at the end of the 1st century. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But wouldn't we expect to find extra biblical references prior to the last century, prior to the last decade of the 1st century, which is presumably kind of 50, 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion?
Well, I don't see why we would. If we look at those other figures that Josephus mentions, we don't have them recorded. We think about people like Hillel and Shammai, who are mentioned in the rabbinic tradition as roughly contemporary with Jesus. And they too are mentioned only later. Rarely is anyone in this time period in history, in fact, rarely is anyone at any point in history prior to very recently, walking around, documenting things, preserving records, making occasional records like the kinds of letters or diary and memoir keeping that we think of today. Things are written about in most instances, probably even today, after the fact, after someone says, oh, this is significant. And so we have people who are part of a movement that looks to Jesus as a central figure, writing about him. And that's what we'd expect. When we have philosophers, the first mention of them is usually by people who are part of a school around them. If they made some sort of what we might call secular impact, then they might turn up, but there's no real obligation to, right? We simply don't have the extent of literacy and the extent of writing about events and people in the ancient world as we take for granted in our own time.
Going back to something that I mentioned earlier, I mentioned miracles. Do you subscribe to the belief that, the walking on water and floating in the sky with Moses and Elijah and so on, do you think that these events actually happened?
I am inclined to be skeptical. I think that it is reasonable to say that if one doesn't have experience of this sort of thing in one's own time, then it's unlikely to have happened in the past. What I can say in my capacity as somebody who does historical research is that people have had trances and altered states of consciousness and believe they saw things which they interpreted in religiously significant ways. And there absolutely could have been some instances of that in conjunction with Jesus. But talking about somebody actually walking on water is not something that a historian will ever be able to do because, again, it's inherently improbable. And the likelihood is always going to be in favor of this being a story that developed as legend or as pure fabrication than as this being something that actually happened.
Okay, so we're basically saying that there is a natural explanation for the miracles described in the Gospels.
Well, as long as one includes in the category of natural explanation the possibility that something was either fabricated or was perceived a certain way and the story got larger. If we look in biblical literature, we can see the figure of Goliath, right, David's opponent in this battle, according to the story, continuing to grow even after the story is written. So our oldest manuscripts have him basically around 6 feet tall, but by the time we get to the Hebrew text of the Bible from about 1,000 years ago, he's 9 feet tall. And so legends grow over time, and things become superior and more elaborate and more impressive over time. And so the historian has to assume that unless there's some really, really incredibly strong evidence of the sort that's not realistic to expect, that in the case of stories about Jesus, they are of the same sort as in the case of other figures about whom such stories are told. And there are plenty of historical figures who are well documented historically, around whom stories of the miraculous grew up and came to be associated.
Okay, so I'm presuming then that you don't subscribe to the view that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, by people who were actually there.
The only Gospel that claims to have an eyewitness source is the Gospel of John, and that claim is made by whoever puts the finishing touches on this text, who says in the last chapter, "We know his testimony is true." In the other cases, I'm less skeptical than some of my colleagues in the field of New Testament study about some of the New Testament authorship attributions. Again, if you're going to invent an attribution of a gospel, especially what seems to be the first one that was ever written, the Gospel of Mark, Mark is not a central figure, an eyewitness. Later tradition would say, well, but he was associated with Peter and so got information from him. But again, this is somebody who is not providing a first-hand account. If we compare the Gospels as well, the literary connection between them also argues against these being written by eyewitnesses. To give one example I think is particularly clear, the Gospel of Matthew was probably deduced as being by someone named Matthew because there's a story in Mark about a tax collector named Levi. The story is retold in Matthew almost word for word in the way that you find in Mark's Gospel. I can't imagine an author who was an eyewitness, who encountered Jesus himself, retelling the story of his own first encounter with Jesus in somebody else's words. That just does not seem plausible.
Now, you talked about the possibility of exaggeration and fabrication and legend and so on in the New Testament, and perhaps this is going beyond the area of your particular expertise. But do you also subscribe to stories about the Exodus and the kingship of David and David's empire and so on? Are they also exaggeration and fabrication or legend as far as you're concerned?
Great question. And the historian has to ask about each individual, but also about each claim about an individual, each saying attributed to them, each event associated with them individually. What is the evidence for this, right? The fact that Alexander the Great, a historian will be skeptical of a claim to divine parentage, doesn't mean that Alexander is therefore less likely to have existed. So in the case of David, I think there's probably good reason to think that there was a dynasty that ultimately stemmed from David. Doesn't look like anything that we would call an empire in the usual sense, whether we'd want to call it a chiefdom or a kingdom or anything else. Those terms are vague, and we need to ask what it might have been like. We certainly do have a House of David and the dynasty of David that traces itself back to this individual. And sometimes dynasties do trace their lineage from a mythical founder, but he's not supposed to have lived that long before we get archaeological and historical textual confirmation of this kingdom and this dynasty for it to be likely that he is a purely mythical figure, right? So it's more likely that he's a figure about whom stories were told. And the fact that we have stories that are uncomplimentary, there's damage control around him taking another man's wife and then arranging for that person to be killed. And so we might have good reason to think that there was a historical David, even if we might wonder whether the kingdoms of David and Solomon were kingdoms or empires of the sort that people have sometimes imagined. We don't really have the claims with regard to David that he was as powerful as I think we sometimes imagine. In the case of the Exodus, we have a different situation again, because there we have good reason to think that if there was a massive departure of the slave labor force from Egypt, accompanied by some natural disasters, right, even if one tones them down a bit, this would leave an impact on Egyptian literature, on Egyptian society. We don't see that, right? And it's not as though Egypt, because of its dry climate, has provided us with lots of papyrus records from a later period. We have inscriptions and things like that. Egyptian history is well documented. And so between that and the lack of evidence for a one-generation-long conquest of Canaan, the evidence that even at the level of their language, of their material culture, the Israelites were themselves Canaanites, all these things together suggest that there was not an Exodus of the sort that's described in the book of Exodus and in Israelite literature. That doesn't mean that there could not have been some events that are part of that tradition that reflect some historical basis, but the story as a whole, at the very least, brings together some myth and legend with some scattered historical details that are probably woven together into a whole in a way that doesn't reflect the details of what happened. So each case has to be judged on its own terms.
And I'm going to turn to matters of faith now and ask a question which is, hopefully you don't take it as being as provocative as it sounds, but...
Well, I like provocative questions.
Okay, good. So why have you lived your life practicing a faith whose holy book contains fabrication, exaggeration, myth, legend, and so on?
That's actually a really wonderful question. I'm kind of disappointed that I don't think anyone's ever asked it quite as directly as that. And I think the question reflects the assumption that a holy book ought to be a compendium of history, some would even say of science, and of things like that. What we actually have here is the literature of a people in the Old Testament, right, the Jewish scriptures, and then the writings of a new religious movement, a messianic movement, focused on this individual Jesus. And the truth is that I've had this personal life-changing experience within the context of this faith. And so this faith provides a framework, provides language for expressing that. I eventually had to admit that it doesn't allow me to bypass asking historical questions. But if we look at these texts, what I think we'll find is that if we treat them seriously as what they actually claim to be and look like, as expressions of faith in an individual, and attempting to offer a biography that is not adopting the kind of historical skepticism that we'd want a modern biographer to. We have letters from somebody who had a life-changing experience, and he clearly does not agree with everybody else who's part of this movement. And so I had a life-changing religious experience. I express it within the context in which that happened, and I ask historical questions because the texts that are the heritage of that faith tradition invite that skepticism, investigation, looking for evidence, asking critical questions.
What you seem to be saying is that you didn't come to faith by reason. And in fact, perhaps, the phrase faith by reason is an oxymoron, maybe. You came to faith because of a religious experience. Can you tell us about that? What happened?
I do want to acknowledge your formulation that prefaced the question itself. My understanding of myself as a Christian is not a result of either arguments from apologists or something like that, or simply upbringing. And I think one of the reasons why I've found it less traumatic than some others have to embrace historical skepticism of an appropriate sort, right? Not an excessive sort, because you can go to an extreme that leads not to critical thinking, but to denialism, right? Where you're skeptical of everything except your own view. So my personal experience, my born-again experience, as it's often referred to, and was essentially this. I had attended a concert at a church where they were singing about their faith in a way that seemed more real than anything I had experienced. Went to the church the next morning, and it wasn't anything specifically about the sermon or something like that. It was just the fact that people seemed to be worshiping and doing things in a way that reflected some sort of real experience. And I was at a challenging point in my life, in my teens, had some difficulties in my own family context, and was deeply unhappy and confused. And so I prayed something to the effect of, God, I don't know what your way of living is, but my way isn't working, and so whatever your way is, I want to try it. And had a sense of peace come over me that really was breathtaking and life-changing. And I will add, since I can foresee a question coming, for a long time, if I tell this story to people in my teens, people would say, okay, well, yeah, sure, there's a psychological explanation for that. And I was adamant, no, this wasn't psychological, it was spiritual.
Next provocative question. I want you to imagine that you were born and you were raised in Mumbai. Would it be fair to say that if that had happened, you'd be a member of the Hare Krishna movement?
Hare Krishna seems rather unlikely, simply because that's was an effort to do something that most Hindus would say is inappropriate, which is to convert other people to Hinduism.
Sure, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that...
I would probably be Hindu.
Exactly, yeah.
And certainly for me, one of the particularly challenging moments in my exploration of my faith was when I finally got around to really digging into other traditions to an extent that I hadn't before. My studies throughout most of my higher education were focused much more on Christian tradition than also things like philosophy of religion, but had not done extensive work on, say, Islam or Hinduism. In other traditions, people have this same kind of experience, have the same kind of encounter with transcendence, and have experiences that point them beyond themselves to some deeper mystery. And those things are expressed in language drawn from one's own heritage. So if my heritage were different, then inevitably I would express that experience and interpret that experience differently. And one reason why I do so within the context of the Christian faith is precisely because it would be unrealistic for me to imagine that I could simply set aside the combined influence of upbringing, culture, and of context within which I had this particular life-changing experience and replace them with something else. When people reject a religious tradition, they still are very often defined by that, right? And so atheists reacting against different religious traditions, often their atheism is configured in different ways as a result of that.
It's like a Christian atheism almost.
Yes, very much so.
I want you to imagine again James being born in India and becoming a Hindu. And if that had happened in some parallel universe, or perhaps I shouldn't be talking about parallel universes, that's a whole other minefield, would you be saved if you were a Hindu? Would you go to heaven? Are Hindus, Muslims, are they excluded from the kingdom of God?
I certainly don't have the impression that the vast majority of biblical authors thought that way. I do wrestle a bit with views of the afterlife. If we were to go back to the Old Testament, to the Jewish scriptures, ancient Israel, there's no focus whatsoever on the afterlife. There's even denial of it. When the prophets come along and threaten the nation with judgment, it's in the form of plague, conquest, exile, famine. It's not punishment in the hereafter. I personally think that matters of afterlife are best left up to God and should not be matters of dogmatism. I don't think it's inappropriate, in view of just how mysterious reality is, to hope and to think that there might be such a thing. What would it be like to live for, will my memory capacity expand infinitely? The way that you put it about going to heaven when you die is actually one that is rather out of keeping with the earliest Christian documents, which were focused not on going to heaven when you die, but on resurrection. The expectation that God would restore human beings at the end of time to bodily existence, and that the afterlife would take some such form. Not necessarily bodies as we now have them, but something bodily. And Paul says that very, very adamantly in places.
So basically, it sounds like you're quite agnostic about the concept of the afterlife. Would it be fair to say that you believe that all of the sorts of images of being tortured and burnt forever and so on and so forth are later additions to the Christian tradition?
Well, certainly a lot of that is later, right? We have the Apocalypse of Peter, and then we have, Dante and others still later. Something that I find problematic in, streams of my own tradition, my own Christian tradition, is the delight that some have taken in imagining torments in the afterlife for their opponents, their evildoers. Sometimes people will say that those who say the wrong things about God, in some minor detail, are destined for eternal torment for getting those things wrong. And I think that's a very problematic view of God as well as of the afterlife to hold.
Throughout our conversation, you seem to be suggesting that you need to consider the context, and you need to consider the possibility of fabrication and exaggeration and so on and so forth. Just a question from a listener. Bear with me, and I'll just give them a shout out, which is Tracy. And Twitter handle at deregulate this. That sounds intriguing. So she has asked me to ask you about your thoughts on the Christian fascism movement. And we had kind of messages going backwards and forwards where I was asking her to define what she meant by it, because I think it's certainly a term that is heard more in the States than it is in the UK. But I guess it's people using the Bible as justification for very right-wing politics. So what is your view on people of that ilk?
I'm, as you probably have gathered, someone who thinks that ultimately the use of the Bible in relation to formulating one's own worldview, perspective in the present day, always has to be one of dialogue. We should not expect that we can simply read ancient texts written by people who assumed that the heart was the locus of human cognition, who didn't know things about the body, about galaxies and other planets, about various things, and expect these texts to answer all of our questions in a direct way. And yet, I also want to emphasize that I think it is incredibly easy to make a case against Christian nationalism and particularly Christian fascism from the overwhelming majority expression within the Christian scriptures and tradition. And it's very, very difficult to make Jesus one who serves the interests of fascism. There's the teaching to love one's enemy, right? There's the crossing of boundaries that were in place between nations, between people. And there's the fact that what became the dominant tradition after him went further still, incorporating uncircumcised Gentiles into the people of God and viewing them as members of the household of Abraham, even though the scriptures were very clear. Genesis was very, very clear, explicitly so, that anyone who becomes part of Abraham's household who is a male has to be circumcised. Doesn't seem to leave for any exception. We find that sort of thing throughout the scriptures. You have the exclusion of Moabite from the community of God's people, and yet you have David said to be descended from a Moabite. And whether or not that's historical is irrelevant. A story being told saying that if you want to exclude this whole people group, you're going to be excluding some famous figures in this tradition because, in fact, those rules have not been consistently followed. And so the biblical tradition as a whole has a lot that runs counter to fascism. On the other hand, the early Christians were not living within the context of a democracy, and they were not in power, and so we don't find them offering legislation. There's certainly principles that one might glean from their practice, how they shared goods, things that they said about rich and poor, but there's no attempt to create a societal framework. And so that's one of those places where certainly it's possible to have different views on what's the best economy, right, for the present day. Even if one goes back into the laws in, say, Leviticus, leaving the edges of fields for the poor will not solve the problem of predominantly urban poverty in the present day. There might be principles there one can learn from, but it's not a solution. And so I don't think that one can jump very directly, but I think there's definitely a preponderance in the teaching of Jesus in particular, but in the Bible, right, from start to finish, that runs counter to any form of fascism.
Apologies for self-plugging here, but I wrote an article for the secular web in the approach to the 2020 presidential election. I'd noticed that people with vastly different political views also use the same Bible for their inspiration or their guidance. I was inspired to write this after hearing a quote from somebody, and I can't remember who the quote is from, and that seems to happen a lot on this podcast. I can remember what people have said, but not who said them. The quote was, "There is no moral guidance in the Bible. People just look to the Bible to shore up beliefs that they already hold. So you can be this nationalist in favor of capital punishment and have a very kind of Old Testament approach to morality, or you can look at the New Testament and look to Jesus's inclusivity, his acceptance of people who were on the fringes of society, and you can base your morality on that." Would that be something that you would subscribe to?
I certainly want to push back a little bit against the dichotomy between Old Testament and New Testament. There's plenty of judgment and of threat in the New Testament, and there's plenty of grace and mercy in the Old Testament. There are no biblical literalists, right? There are people who selectively take certain parts of the Bible and may treat what the English translation says in a literalistic sort of fashion, but no one does that consistently throughout the Bible because the Bible says a range of things.
Okay, so do you think it's inconsistent or it's not intellectually honest to say that all of the Bible is true?
I don't think it makes any sense because there are a range of different things in the Bible. And the Bible is not a whole. It's a compendium of literature. And the divide is not, as you'll sometimes hear, between sort of Old Testament, God of wrath, New Testament, God of love, things like that. When Jesus is saying what he thinks is the most important law, there's love for God, right, from Deuteronomy, and then love for neighbor from Leviticus. Most people don't think of Leviticus in those terms. Leviticus also has the Jubilee year, right? Once a generation, setting slaves free, returning property to its prior owner. And so there's some radical economic policy in there that you don't get in the New Testament because they were not in power and didn't have any chance of implementing it. But the early Christians, on the one hand, affirmed those texts as their scripture, and on the other hand show that the fact that something was in their scripture didn't mean that they necessarily applied it, that they just embraced it unquestioningly. And so even within the scriptures themselves, we see a different sort of engagement than the sort that conservative religiosity tends to promote and to claim to practice, even though on closer inspection it does not. I do want to add, though, that you sometimes hear as well, and this is true in English classes, never mind in biblical interpretation, that you can make a text say anything. And when you have a compendium, there's certainly some truth in that, but often a particular individual is fairly consistent, right? A particular author, a particular work, and they just have different views. And those different views should be taken seriously as part of one's heritage. But I don't think that texts are infinitely flexible. I think that one can certainly look at, say, the teaching of Jesus and what some people who engage in online hate speech spout while claiming to be devotees of Jesus and say, no, in fact, what this person is doing with this text is problematic. I think there's a lot of room for interpretation. But again, each text needs to be interpreted on its own terms and looked at on its own terms. Some texts in the Bible, we don't even know what they mean. Right? We're not even sure linguistically what they mean. In some cases, there's more than one way we could understand the wording. In some cases, they're quite clear. And the fact that something is clear doesn't necessarily mean that one should apply it today or follow it today, right? One has to ask other questions besides what do these texts say. My point is simply that I'm not persuaded that all biblical texts are equally flexible and can support any sort of viewpoint, although people, as you said, do start from whatever they believe and look to the Bible for something to justify and support it rather than being open to things that might challenge their assumptions.
Next question. Was Jesus divine?
Well, my favorite answer to that question is that he said he was in the Gospel of John, where he said, "I am divine, you are the branches." But that's a joke.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't get it.
Sorry. But in the New Testament, Jesus is not depicted as divine in the sense of walking around believing himself to be the second person of the Trinity or something like that. Even in the Gospel of John, which depicts Jesus as the Word made flesh, as the Son of Man who came down from heaven, he still is depicted as praying to the Father and referring to the Father as the only true God. In the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus is an individual whom God has sent, appointed, chosen, empowered with God's Spirit, and is not himself a divine figure. The belief of Christians was that Jesus is exalted to a position of universal rule over all creation, second only to the one God. We get that in 1 Corinthians 15. And so to the extent that we have Jesus exalted to rule of this sort in the thinking of the early Christians, they believed that he was exalted to a position that probably deserves to be called divinity. But if one is going to use that language at all, one has to nuance it clearly. One has to contextualize it in terms of how ancient people thought and how it's different from how modern people think about these things. One has to try to avoid reading back into the earliest Christian texts, doctrines that not only were formulated later, but that were formulated later as a result of intense, heated, ongoing debate and discussion, precisely because there weren't clear answers available that settled the matter.
Okay, so Jesus wasn't God walking around 2,000 years ago, in your opinion?
No, and that's, I think, important because if we come back to the place that we started with the Christ myth, it's like, well, if you have a figure who's God in the flesh walking around, then somebody's going to mention him. And again, that's reading later doctrine back, right? That's trying to make a historical claim about the unlikelihood of Jesus' existence without treating these texts in an appropriate historical manner, which means you start with the earliest, you look at what's said in them, and you look at how the tradition develops. And so more often than not, I'm struck by how much proponents of the Christ myth are actually assuming Christian doctrine of a later time, right? Yeah. Whereas the liberal Christians and most atheist scholars and other people will say, yeah, no, looking at these, Jesus is not that sort of figure, right? Whereas for many Christ myth people, it's just they heard of a divine Jesus without asking the historically critical types of questions.
You seem to be suggesting there that Jesus was a man chosen by God and a very special person, but not equivalent to God. Does that mean you don't believe in the Trinity?
In terms of talking about my own views, I certainly managed to upset some strict monotheists, sort of Unitarians and folks like that, who really liked the fact that I was presenting the case so strongly that the early Christians did not believe Jesus to be divine. They were not Trinitarians, and then said that I do have some appreciation for Trinitarian language. I'm not at all opposed to that sort of language. I think all language that human beings use in reference to the divine, the transcendent, is symbolic, and so I tend not to gravitate towards that language because of my historical conclusions about the meaning of the New Testament, but I shouldn't be treated as adamantly opposed to those who do.
So just one more question before we finish up. Jesus, as you're suggesting, is exalted by God, selected by God to, I guess, liaise with mankind to show us what God's like, perhaps, or how to live our lives. Was it a missed opportunity for Jesus who have said things like slavery is bad, don't abuse children, don't develop nuclear weapons in the future or whatever. Jesus' criticism of slavery is non-existent. Was that a missed opportunity, do you think? Or perhaps he did say those things and they're just not recorded.
Always possible, at least in theory. I would say that if one were to say that Jesus is sort of God in the flesh, not a human being with human limitations, the biblical authors are divinely inspired so that they are freed, at least in the process of writing, from human limitations, then the Bible is full of missed opportunities. Sure, it's great to provide supposedly miraculous healings, but why not give a recipe for soap, and instructions on washing one's hand? Cover your mouth when you cough. Explain that even though you can't see them, there are viruses and bacteria, and illnesses are not caused by demons and by other things. The truth is that the biblical texts, if you make claims about them being divinely inspired in a sense that they no longer are human writings, then not just what's in them is problematic, but what's lacking from them. And we have actually seen religious believers try to make the claim that the Bible, and in Islam, the Quran, and in Hinduism, some of the Vedas and things like that, have science ahead of their time. No one who is not an adherent to the religion is going to be likely to find them plausible. And so I think that often the religious doctrines about the Bible and about Jesus lead to those who are not coming from a perspective of faith to judge the literature and judge him harshly, as though it should have been even more ahead of its time than it was. If there is acceptance across divisions that most people accepted hatred as the appropriate view of the other, then we can appreciate that, right? And not talk about it as something miraculous, but say, in the context of its time, there's some positive steps here. And yet still say, from our perspective, looking back, does it go nearly far enough? You asked me about my religious affiliation, and so I can actually come back to that. I've settled in the American Baptist tradition. People in various parts of the world sometimes have just heard of the Southern Baptists. The Southern Baptist denomination came into existence breaking away from the main denomination that's now called the American Baptist over the issue of slavery. They wanted to have slaves, and the denomination as a whole had moved in the direction of abolitionism and prohibiting people serving as missionaries who owned slaves and things like that. And there are texts within the Bible that one can point to that accept slavery, that make laws regarding slavery, and the doctrine of biblical inerrancy seems to have come about largely in response to that, right? If you say that Paul was wrong, that Moses was wrong, right, assuming the authorship of these things in ways that a scholar might not, but anyway, then you're saying that these figures were wrong and that God was wrong, right, inspiring them and so on and so forth. And so biblical inerrancy was actually developed as a justification for this. The argument of the abolitionist was there are principles that Jesus taught us, like treat others the way you want to be treated, right, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Would you want to be someone else's property? No? Okay, there's your case for abolition. And so looking back, some of what's in there about slavery doesn't go nearly far enough. On the other hand, I think it's fair, and I would not continue to identify as a Christian if I did not also find some things in there that I thought had pointed people in the right direction and that could still be inspiring to explore and ponder the meaning of existence in our own time.
Excellent, James. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise this morning. And I hope you've enjoyed being a part of the UnShaw podcast.
Yes, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I hope that your listeners enjoyed listening to it. And yeah, I hope that if it leads to follow-up questions, that whether on Twitter or on my blog or someplace else, that people will feel free to ask. I don't always have time to answer, and sometimes people ask some very strange questions, but in general, I'm always happy to expand further when there's interest.
So thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the UnShaw Podcast. And if you have any questions for James, feel free to reach out to him on Twitter or X @religionprof. You could also find a link to his blog on his Twitter page where you can contact him directly. And don't forget James's book, The A to Z of the New Testament, which offers a primer in New Testament theology for the layman, published just last year. As we wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge that it's Mothering Sunday in the UK today. Let's take a moment to honour and celebrate all mothers around the world. Stepmothers, foster mothers, those who have experienced loss, mothers who have miscarried or given birth to stillborn babies. We also recognise grandmothers, mothers of fur babies, and of course the nurturing love of Mother Earth, which sustains us all. Join us again next week for another insightful episode of the UnShaw Podcast. Until then, take care.